next speaker is Hamish King, who's the CEO of Cisema. Cisema is a regulatory consultancy, extensive experience in the Chinese market. So really excited to hear his insights on the registration process for healthcare innovations in China. Hamish?
Hi, thank you. Thanks, it's Hamish here. Thanks, Matthew. Just sharing my screen. Okay, can you see my screen okay? Just to double check.
Yep, coming through great.
Great, thanks. So good morning, everybody, or good evening from Asia. Yes, I'm Hamish. I'm CEO at Cisema. I'm going to talk for around 15 minutes with about 10 content slides to give you a helicopter overview of getting your registration or marketing approval for your medical device, IVD, pharmaceutical product, including APIs, packaging, and excipients. My colleague Victoria was also supposed to join, but she's come down with laryngitis and lost her voice, so it's just me for today. Here's a brief rundown just about the topics. So we're going to have a quick look at medical device pathways for your product, clinical trial requirements, costs and timelines, as well as local agent requirements. There was a bit of from Richard about the last session about local support, and I'm going to reiterate about that for both your drug and your device products. For drugs, I'm going to spend a little bit of time in the very brief time available. Of course, there's so much subtleties which I can't dive into about classification, costs, drug master filing, as well as some alternatives that you might consider as part of your entry. So first of all, medical device, your medical device and IVD registration pathways. What does that look like? Either you can, of course, go direct to the market, which is mainland. That looks like an application to the key regulator, which is the National Medical Products Administration, or NMPA for short. This pathway takes around 4 months for a class 1 product, 18 months for a class 2 product, or 21 months for a class 3 product. You will require, if you're a class 2 or class 3 product, a registration process, which means a detailed technical review, local testing in China of your product, as well as a detailed clinical evaluation report, which is China specific, or you will require a clinical trial. And actually that is the default for most class 2 and 3 products, unless you can find some alternative, which I'll speak about briefly. There are some fast track pathways, or the innovative medical device application pathway if it's considered an innovative product in China. Actually, historically, the innovative pathway has tended to be reserved for, in practice, reserved for Chinese products, Chinese companies, although that seems to be opening up as we've seen in the last year or so. I won't go into much detail about it now, except to say that the innovative product pathway is interesting because it allows you to apply for China without home country jurisdiction. So you don't need your UK or CE mark approvals before you apply under the innovative medical device application pathway. You do if you're applying under the standard application. You do, however, or you will, for the innovative application, require a China patent, which others have talked about and I won't go into. There are just some alternatives that I'd like to highlight very briefly to ensure you have the bird's eye view. One is to go into Hong Kong. I'm speaking from Hong Kong today. Richard mentioned that you used to, start here as part of your entry strategy. I've been in Hong Kong for 7 years, and I'm a lawyer by training. I used to work at Linklaters, and Linklaters presented yesterday. I'm now in the more specific regulatory side of things, and I think it's, we still see some companies coming to Hong Kong first, and it is something still to consider, because Hong Kong for your product is a voluntary listing system. So you can start selling here tomorrow without any marketing approval process. And so that can be quite attractive, even if it is a smaller market of 7 million people. What's even more interesting is the recent policies for the Greater Bay Area, which has a population of around 70 million. So, somewhat bigger than the UK or equivalent, or Germany even for that matter. And it includes Shenzhen, it includes Guangzhou and the broader GBA or Guangzhou region. I'm going to talk about that very briefly as well. But if you have Hong Kong listing, you can then apply to sell your product into the Greater Bay Area. And there's a brief thing about that. Or Hainan, which is an island off the south of China. That's another alternative pathway. I won't spend much time on that at all today, except to say that this is another alternative which relies on your home country jurisdiction approvals and allows you to sell into this one area within Hainan to at least get some revenues, to perhaps get some data on Chinese patients, which may allow you to therefore minimize or reduce or even remove altogether your trial in China requirements, your clinical trial in China requirements, because there may be some ethnic requirements that you haven't covered. Okay, so the after the broad pathways, the key question is a clinical trial needed for your product? Because by default for class 2 and 3 medical devices, you will require a clinical trial unless you can fall under some of these exemptions. A class 1 filing product does not require testing or trials, so that's simple. But for a class 2 and 3 product, it's more complicated. There's a decision tree here, which I'll just go through briefly. It's about the risk of the product. It's about whether the product is on a specific exemption list, then it's clear, no trials needed. It's about whether you maybe have data or clinical trial data collected outside China and sufficient data. If so, you may be able to just use that for your China application marketing approval. And then it's about whether you can locate a predicate device in China, which means a product that has already been approved in China that has similarities or equivalencies with your own product, and you have sufficient data about that product, which can be the difficult part because it's usually a competitor product. And that's the final point. In terms of broad costs and timelines, which is the next question, of course, that you'd like to know. For a medical device, you are looking at a nil application fee, and I'm just talking about the specific government fees for submitting your dossier to obtain approval. It's just a filing for a class 1 product. For a class 2 product, it's around £25,000, British pounds. And for a class 3 product, it's around £37,000 for the application fee alone. Of course, this is just the application fee. There's many other costs, including local testing, which I mentioned, which is mandatory for class 2 and 3 products, medical devices. For your IVD products, they will also need to do a clinical tests in China. There's other costs relating to notarization, the clinical evaluation report preparation, because you cannot simply translate your CE or UK CER into Chinese and submit it because China has specific standards and requirements. There's translation, there's other costs as well. Timelines I mentioned a little bit earlier: 4 months for class 1, 18 months for a class 2, and approximately 21 months for a class 3 medical device. IVDs can be equivalent, but generally a bit more because they require clinical tests or more substantial trials on the whole for the China marketing approval application. You need to be represented by a local entity in China in order to submit your application. You have 3 broad options for that local entity. The default will often be the distributor, because that is what you will do in many other jurisdictions. You will let the distributor handle everything. I caution you, and maybe that's a similar phrase that's been repeated throughout the summit. I caution you about this because you need to be careful and thoughtful with your IP. You have to provide a lot of data, a lot of information, and if you're providing that to a third party who may have conflicts here, then that's something really to think about closely before you do so. The belts and braces approach, of course, is to set up your own subsidiary in China, but there is a third option, which is to have an independent third party. Cisema acts in this role for many of our customers, and tend to find it helpful because we do this all the time. We can, for relatively low cost. It's a more convenient way to enter the market. It also allows you to use more than one distributor, because the local agent or NMPA legal agent needs to help with the first import of the product for each distributor. So if your one distributor acts as the local agent, then they may well be very reticent to allow or work with another distributor. And China is such a large country that having one distributor, even for some of the big cities, is insufficient. And if you're already selling in China and wondering why your volumes aren't what you expected, then your distributor strategy may be something to think about. If you'd like to know more about this in this very short run through, of course, please get in touch and let me know. So yeah, we really don't have much time, and there's so many topics that we could cover. That's a very brief run through for medical device. I'm just going to touch on the drugs pharma registration pathways very briefly as well, just to point out that there are three broad categories of chemical drugs, or I should say of drugs altogether: chemical drugs, traditional Chinese medicine, and biologics. We won't talk about Chinese medicine further in this session. We'll just talk a little bit about chemical drugs and biologics. Chemical drugs can be further subdivided into new drugs, generic drugs, imported, or generic drugs local. And further, for drugs that are imported, there are generally only a few classes out of the 5 total classes that are permitted for imported products. That's class 1, innovative new drugs not marketed anywhere in the world. Class 2, improved new drugs not marketed anywhere in the world. Class 5.1, new drugs or improved drugs that have been marketed in other countries but not China. And 5.2, generics that have been marketed in other countries but not yet China. For biologics, there are a similar number of classes. There are 3 broad categories of prevention, treatment, biologics, and IVDs managed as biologic products, which go through the drug registration pathway rather than the IVD pathway. I won't spend more time going into the detail here about the biologics, but I've got some data just on the slide as a brief overview. If you'd like to know more, then please get in touch and ask for our white paper or other information or sessions. In terms of what your marketing approval process looks like for your drug product, new drugs go through detailed clinical trial requirements. Traditionally, or I should say previously, they had to start their clinical trials again in China in order to get approvals. That no longer is the case. You can rely on your trial data outside China to a certain extent. You still will likely need to do some trials in China. And there's of course, there's a whole trial application process and requirements for that too, which we don't have time for today. In terms of just the broad submission process, there's a after your submission is completed or rather approved for administrative purposes, there may be a submission test required, which is a local China test, somewhat equivalent to the medical device test requirements, before you receive acceptance review, which has around a week timeline. There's then the detailed technical review, which looks like a 40 working days for completeness review. Then there's a risk-based decision on whether to initiate these on-site inspections and registration tests, after which there is a comprehensive review and perhaps a supplementary process as well, which is a process that asks for more questions from the applicant. The total timeline for review is around 280 working days, followed by a 20 working day approval time and a further 10 working days to receive the certificate. Pre-submission, I'll just touch on very briefly. Applicants should submit in general, we recommend our clients to submit a pre-submission planning form, which is something that's evolved relatively recently in China. It traditionally, there was no sort of pre-submission process in the same way as other jurisdictions, but that is rapidly developing. So that's something to also consider and think about to ensure that the data you've collected will be acceptable. And here's one of my close to last slides about just the drug products, supporting products, that's APIs, excipients, and packaging. They can now submit a drug master filing or a China DMF that allows them to keep their information confidential from their drug end product customer. They can go through 3 broad pathways. That's the together with the drug dossier, which is the traditional approach, or a binding technical review, which is on the right side of the screen, which is the more interesting, popular method these days for such manufacturers. APIs have the third option of having an independent approval, which is not tied to any specific drug product. So that may be interesting to some API manufacturers, and I'm happy to talk further as needed. Application fees for drug products are shown here on the slide, excuse me. There's different prices for products that are manufactured domestically or manufactured overseas. And I've just set those out here on the slide. For a clinical trial application, an imported product would pay 376,000 RMB, and for a marketing approval application, it's nearly 600,000 CNY. Okay, here's my second to final slide, just about the Greater Bay Area and Hong Kong and Shenzhen, Guangzhou, Greater Bay Area, which just may be of interest to attendees. There are 5 designated hospitals in the Greater Bay Area outside of Hong Kong, which are actually listed here on the slide. They allow, as I mentioned at the start, they allow Hong Kong listed products that are sold in Hong Kong public hospitals to also apply to the Guangdong MPA, that's the Guangdong regulator, provincial regulator, to sell into the Greater Bay Area to these 5 specific hospitals. I say 5 because actually, breaking news just a week or 2 ago, another 14 hospitals were added. It applies both to drugs and medical device. As I said, there's breaking news as of February 22, 14 hospitals have now been added to the list. So that substantially increases your potential for sales in the Greater Bay Area. The exciting thing about this Greater Bay Area, Hong Kong listing into Greater Bay Area sales, is that it does allow you to get some product market fit experiments, so to speak, while gaining revenue before you make the big submission to the NMPA itself. It also allows you to access what is actually a very large, substantial market of, as I mentioned, some 70 million people in the Greater Bay Area. Stage entry, as I mentioned, a test of the market, generates some revenue. It allows faster sales to at least some parts of China. However, it will only allow you to shorten the total timeline to whole of China approvals if it enables you to collect some data, some real world data on Chinese population that removes the need to do in China clinical trials. I don't have time to go into the real world data point here, but it's just something to be aware of. So far, there's been 23 drugs and 13 medical devices approved by for the Hong Kong listing into Greater Bay Area sales. There's a list here on the slide which I've shared, and that's all the content I wanted to mention today. Just a bit about Cisema, as Matthew mentioned, we're a regulatory affairs consultancy for China. We help with the in China approvals, submission dossiers, drafting, testing, clinical trials as needed, local agent support, Hong Kong listing, the testing, which is very important, as well as through to post-registration, including factory inspections, post-market surveillance, and all the rest. Okay, thank you, Matthew. That's me. And here's, sorry, one more slide, but that's me finished. Thank you.
Cheers, Hamish. Great stuff. Really appreciate you sharing a lot of really nice info in there. I hope all our attendees were taking notes. Just time for one quick question. And this actually comes from one of our panelists from day one. Is there a benefit to having your product manufactured in China and essentially becoming a Chinese produced product if you have a JV set up already?
Yeah, interesting question, because it is a popular topic, localization or in China for China strategy. It depends is the answer. We're seeing some customers need to do it because there are specific volume-based procurement requirements, or buy China kind of policies, if not by the national government, then also by the provincial. That tends to apply to more Me Too products, or sort of volume products. Yeah, which certainly there are a few of course of the imported products. So it depends. We see some of our customers doing both. They apply for the localization. They try to set up some sort of localization manufacturing, and actually we support customers to determine what is the minimum production step that needs to be done in China to be determined as a made in China product. So this has been quite popular, and so it's thinking about all those things. So the answer is yes, there is a trend to localization in China, but certainly not for all products, and certainly companies are wary about the potential IP leakage risks of doing so, as well as the cost and whether
Sure.
it really makes sense.
Sure. Yeah, I think it's kind of with everything we've seen, case by case basis, and make sure you've got yourself covered before taking any actual steps. Cool, lovely. Well, thank you, Hamish, for sharing. Really appreciate it. And we'll move right along here.